Hello, welcome back to chapter 20 of Momo. We're on the last two chapters, so it's getting really exciting. But before I start, today is the 22nd of April, which is also Earth Day, International Earth Day, a day of remembering and celebrating the Earth with all its amazingness. And I just wanted to say that there's a lot of us that are struggling with the isolation and all the different things happening at the moment. But I really hope that out of this comes us all realising more about what's really important in our lives and realising how important nature is and the way we interconnect with nature, the rest of nature, because we're part of nature. And so I hope there will be a big silver lining for us living with nature and the earth a lot better from now on. So, Are you sitting comfortably?
Yes, and I really like that. And we've got to remember all the other animals we share the planet with, the dolphins, the whales, the kangaroo, the little peliquins, and all the different things.
I agree. I think we need to take care of all the nature around us.
Yes.
Okay, so if you're not comfortable yet, snuggle up, get as comfortable as you possibly can. And if you're still not able to get comfortable, then hopefully listening to this will make you even feel more comfortable. Here goes. Momo's first step was to open the little door with Professor Hora's name on it. Then she sped along the corridor lined with statues and opened the big bronze front door. She had to exert all her strength because it was so heavy. That done, she ran back to the great hall and waited with Cassiopeia in her arms to see what would happen next. She didn't have to wait long. There was a sudden jolt, but it didn't actually shake the ground. It was a timequake, so to speak. Not an earthquake. No words could describe the sensation, which was accompanied by a sound such as no human ear had ever heard before. A sigh that seemed to issue from the depths of the ages. And then it was over. Simultaneously, the innumerable clocks stopped ticking, whirring and chiming. Pendulums came to a sudden halt and stayed put at odd angles. The silence that fell was more profound than any that had ever reigned before. Time itself was standing still. As for Momo, she became aware that she was clasping the stem of an hour lily of exceptional size and beauty. She hadn't felt anyone put it into her hand. It simply appeared as if it had always been there. Gingerly, Momo took a step. Sure enough, she could move as easily as ever. The remains of breakfast were still on the table. She sat down on one of the little armchairs, but the seat was as hard as marble and didn't yield an inch. There was a mouthful of chocolate left in her cup, but the cup wouldn't move either. She tried dipping her finger into the dregs, but they were as hard as butterscotch. So was the honey, and even the crumbs were stuck fast to the plate. Now that time had stopped, everything else was immovable. Cassiopeia had started to fidget. Looking down, Momo saw some words on her shell. "You're wasting time." Heavens alive, so she was. Momo pulled herself together. She hurried through the forest of clocks to the little door, squeezed through it and ran along the passage to the front door. She peered out, then darted back in panic. Her heart began to thump furiously. Far from running away, the time thieves were streaming towards her, up Never Lane. They could do that, of course, now time had ceased to flow in reverse there, but she hadn't allowed for the possibility. She raced back to the great hall and, still clutching Cassiopeia, hid behind a massive grandfather clock. "That's a good start," she muttered ruefully. Then she heard the men in grey come marching along through the corridor. They squeezed through the little door, one after another, until a whole crowd of them had assembled inside. "So this is our new headquarters," one said, surveying the vast room. "Very impressive. Very, very impressive." "That girl let us in," said another grey voice. "I distinctly saw her open the door. The sensible child. I wonder how she managed to get around the old man." "If you ask me," said a third voice, "the old man knuckled under. If time had stopped flowing in Never Lane, it can only mean he switched it off. Himself. In other words, he knows he's beaten." "Where is he, the old mischief maker? Let's finish him off." The men in grey were looking around when one of them had a sudden thought. His voice sounded even greyer, if possible, than the rest. "Something's wrong, gentlemen," he said. "The clocks. Look at the clocks." Every one of them has stopped, even the hourglass." "I suppose he must have stopped them," said another voice, uncertainly. "You can't stop an hourglass," the first man in grey retorted. "See for yourself, gentlemen. The sand's suspended in mid-air, and the hourglass itself won't budge." "What does it mean?" He was still speaking when footsteps came pounding along the corridor, and yet another man in grey squeezed through the little door, gesticulating wildly. "We've had no word from our agents in the city," he announced. Their cars have stopped, and so has everything else. The world's at a standstill. There isn't a microsecond of time to be had anywhere. Our supplies have been cut off. Time has ceased to exist. Horror has switched us off." There was a deadly hush. Then someone said, "What do you mean, switched it off?" "What'll become of us when we've finished the cigars we're smoking?" "What'll become of us?" shouted someone else. "You know that perfectly well. This is disastrous, gentlemen." They all began to shout at once. "Horror's planning to destroy us. We must lift the siege at once. We must try to reach the time store. Without our cars, we'll never make it in time. My cigar won't last me more than 27 minutes. Mine will last for 48. Give it to me, then." "Are you crazy?" "It's every man to himself." There was a concerted rush to the little door. From her hiding place, Momo saw panic-stricken grey figures trying to squeeze through it, jostling, scuffing, and swapping punches in a desperate attempt to save their grey lives. The rush became a violent melee as they knocked each other's hats off, wrestled with one another, snatched the cigars from each other's mouths, and whenever they lost their cigars, they seemed to lose every ounce of strength as well. They stood there with their arms outstretched in a plaintive, terrified expression growing on their faces, and growing more and more transparent until they finally vanished. Nothing remained of them, not even their hats. In the end, only 3 men in grey were left. They ducked through the little door, one after another, and scuttled off down the passage. Momo with Cassiopeia under one arm and her free hand tightly clutching the hour lily, ran after them. All now depended on her keeping them in sight. She saw when she emerged from the front door that they had already reached the mouth of Never Lane. More smoke-wreathed men in grey were standing there, talking and gesticulating excitedly. As soon as they caught sight of the three fugitives from Nowhere House, they started running too. Others joined the stampede, and soon the whole army had taken to its heels. More haste, less speed! Of course, no longer applied now that time was at a standstill. An endless column of grey figures streamed towards the city through the strange, dreamlike district, with its snow-white houses and oddly assorted shadows, past the monument resembling an egg, until it came to the grey, shabby tenements inhabited by people who lived on the edge of time. Here, too, though everything was still and silent. What followed was a chase in reverse, a chase in which countless grey figures were pursued through the city at a discreet distance behind the last stragglers by a girl with a flower in her hand and a tortoise under her arm. But how strange the city looked now! Long lines of cars choked the streets with the fumes from their exhausts solidified, and behind each wheel sat a motionless driver, one hand frozen on a horn or gear lever. Momo even caught sight of one of the drivers, who had been immobilized while glaring at his neighbour and meaningfully tapping his forehead. Cyclists were poised at road junctions with their arms extended, signalling right or left, and the people thronging the pavements resembled waxwork figures. The traffic policemen stood at crossroads, whistles in their mouths, caught in the act of waving the traffic on. A flock of pigeons hovered motionless above a square, and high overhead, as though painted in the sky, an equally motionless aeroplane. The water in the fountain might have been ice. Leaves falling from the trees were suspended in mid-air, and one little dog, which was cocking its leg against the lamp-post, looked as if it had been stuffed that way. Lifeless as a photograph, the city rang to the hurrying footsteps of men in grey. Momo followed them curiously, fearful of being spotted, but she needn't have worried. Their headlong flight was proving so arduous and exhausting that they had ceased to notice anything else anymore. Unaccustomed to running so far and so fast, they panted and gasped for breath, grimly clenching their teeth on the little grey cigars that kept them in existence. More than one of them let his cigar fall while running and vanished into thin air before he could retrieve it. But their companions in misfortune represented an even greater threat. Such was the desperation of those whose own cigars were almost finished, that many of them snatched the butts from their neighbours' mouths, so their numbers slowly, steadily dwindled. Those who still had a small store of cigars in their briefcases were careful to conceal them from the others, because the have-nots kept hurling themselves at the haves and trying to wrest their precious possessions from them. Scores of struggling figures engaged in ferocious tussles, scrabbling and crawling with such wild abandon and clawing with such wild abandon that most of the coveted cigars spilled on the road and were trampled underfoot. The men in grey had become so frightened of extinction that they completely lost their heads. There was something else that caused them increasing difficulty. The further into town they got, the streets were so crowded that at many points it was all they could do to thread their way through the forest of motionless pedestrians. Momo, being small and thin, had an easier time of it, but even she had to watch her step. You could hurt yourself badly on a feather suspended in mid-air if you ran into it by mistake. On and on and on they went, and Momo still had no idea how much further it was to the time store. She peered anxiously at her hour lily, but it had only just come into full flower. There was no need to worry yet. Then something happened that temporarily drove every other thought from her mind. Glancing down a side street, she caught sight of Beppo. "Beppo!" she called, beside herself with joy, as she ran towards him. "I've been looking for you everywhere. Where have you been all this time? Why did you never come to see me? Oh, Beppo, dearest Beppo!" Still clutching Cassiopeia, she flung her free arm around his neck and promptly bounced off, because he might have been made of cast iron. It was such a painful collision that tears sprang to her eyes. She stepped back, sobbing, and gazed at him. The little old man looked more bent back than ever. His kindly face was thin and gaunt and very pale, and his chin was frosted with white stubble, because he so seldom found time to shave nowadays. Incessant sweeping had worn away his broom until the bristles were little longer than his beard. There he stood, as motionless as everyone and everything else, staring down at the dirty street through his steel-rimmed spectacles. Momo had found him at long last, but only now, when she couldn't get him to notice her. It might be the very last time she saw him. If things went wrong, old Beppo would continue to stand there forever. Cassiopeia started fidgeting again. "Keep going," she spelled out. Momo dashed back to the main street and stopped dead. There were no men in grey to be seen. She ran on a little way, but it was no use. She'd lost track of them. She halted again, wondering what to do, and looked inquiringly at Cassiopeia. "Keep going," the toy signalled again. Then, "You'll find them." If Cassiopeia knew in advance that she would find the time thieves, she would find them, whichever way she went. Any direction was bound to be the right one, so she simply ran on, turning left or right as she fancied. She had now reached a housing development on the city's northern outskirts, where the buildings were as alike as peas in a pod, and the streets ran dead straight from horizon to horizon. On and on and on she ran, but the sheer sameness of the buildings and streets soon made her feel as if she were running on the spot and getting nowhere. The housing development was a veritable maze, but a maze that deceived one by its regularity and uniformity. Momo had almost lost hope when she caught sight of a man in grey disappearing around a corner. He was limping along with his suit in tatters and his bowler hat and briefcase gone, mouth grimly pursed around the smouldering butt of a little grey cigar. She followed him along a street flanked by endless rows of houses until they came to a gap. The big rectangular site where the missing house should have stood was boarded up, and set in the fence was a gate. The gate was a little ajar, and a last grey straggler squeezed quickly through it. There was a notice above the gate. Momo paused to read. "Danger! Keep out! No unauthorized persons admitted." That's the end of chapter 20. That means there's only one last chapter to go. I read it to you tomorrow. Getting excited. Okay, hope you enjoyed. Take care wherever you are. Keep connected. That's love. Bye for now.